You may have a fancy GUI or WYSIWYG kind of operating system like Windows, but there are times you have to get into the command line. And to guide us through the command line, we've got Dakota Snow. Dakota, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you today?
Not too bad, not too bad. Folks, we are fellow Pacific Northwesterners, Dakota and I. Where are you from, Dakota? And tell us a bit about your current position in the IT world.
Absolutely. So I'm based out of Oregon. I am currently the director of network operations for a local internet service provider. We are delivering gigabit internet to rural Oregon currently, so it's a lot of fun.
It's nice to talk to a fellow Oregonian and somebody who should have been providing me internet 40 years ago. Where were you?
Yeah, absolutely. I get that all the time.
When it comes to the support side of things, how much time do you spend in the command line? I spend a lot of time in it.
When it comes to troubleshooting and support, I probably spend about 80% of my time in the actual command line, the command prompt, and then I also spend some time in PowerShell as well. So.
Right. I like PowerShell, gives me a history and all sorts of fanciness, but the command prompt, both of them are very powerful tools that allow you to, solve problems and things like that. Let's start on the networking side. What are some of the most common tools, and how do you go about using them in a command line?
Absolutely. And whenever I'm doing some troubleshooting, especially when it comes to networking, I always start at the basics. The very first command I always start with is ipconfig. I always check my local IP configuration, make sure I have a good IP address, double check my DNS settings, make sure I have a good default gateway. I always look over those configurations to make sure they're at least what I expect them to be.
It's always nice when they are what you expect them to be. I've noticed, back in the day, you hit ipconfig, even ipconfig /all, and you'd get a couple of interfaces. Right nowadays, you get a whole lot of interfaces. Let's talk about some of those things that you tend to see.
Absolutely. A lot of times, especially nowadays due to COVID, you are running a VPN. So a lot of times you'll see a virtual adapter for your VPN connection. If you're running any virtual machines, you might see a virtual adapter for a virtual machine. You have your wireless connection. You have a wired connection. Sometimes you might even have multiple of those. You'll see those when you run an ipconfig or ipconfig/all command.
When it comes to actually troubleshooting the network, let's start with the ping command. And how do you go about using that from pinging IP addresses to default gateways to DNS names, things like that?
Absolutely. And that's really the second command I do. Once I figure out I have a good IP address, I'll use the ping command. And one of the first things I'll do is I'll ping my gateway, my device that communicates with the internet. I'll ping that gateway device and make sure I have good communication with that device. Typically, go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead, man.
Typically after that, I will then reach out to a device on the internet, but instead of using its domain name, like its actual web address, its name, I'll use its IP address. So I'll ping like 8.8.8, which is Google DNS server. And the reason I do that is because I want to make sure I can ping an address out on the internet without having to use DNS to look up the actual IP address of that domain name. So I'll ping like 8.8.8, and then I'll go out and ping like Google or something like that after that to make sure DNS is working.
You use traceroute much?
I do. That's another great tool. It's a very powerful tool. So when you use the traceroute command, it will actually show you the path your internet traffic is taking to get to the end destination. It will show you all the different hops in between your machine and that end device. So it kind of shines more light onto a troubleshooting situation.
Sure. And then you've got like the path ping command that kind of combines ping and traceroute a bit. I suppose you can use that as well.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about group policies, because it's not just when you open the command line, you're not just messing around with networking or troubleshooting networking. You're also doing things with group policies. What are some of the command line options that you use when you're managing group policies?
So the most common one I find myself using is GP update, which is group policy update. And especially become apparent nowadays due to COVID, where you might have a machine that's not constantly checking in with the domain controller. And when you actually get a connection back to the domain controller, you might have to run a GP update or a GP update force to force the group policies to update on that end host.
And so that basically allows, it forces an update. And then that way, that system is compliant with, say, the rest of the systems that should be automatically doing things, right?
Absolutely.
But you find a lot of that happening, I'm sure, nowadays with, like there are some stragglers out there or systems that aren't keeping pace with the policy and all that.
Absolutely. Yeah, you'll find systems that aren't, touching base with the domain controller as often. And when they do come back on the domain network, you have to do that GP update to get them all synchronized and, having all the current policies or, any of the current information.
One last thing I like to hit here when it comes to it. If you come across a command that you don't know much about, there's the good old fashioned, right? You name the command, you hit a space, right, and then you do it's / and then a question mark. Is that right?
Absolutely. So that command there it will give you a list of all the different options you have to go from. So like let's use the IP config for example. If you do IP config space / question mark, it will list out all the different options you have to the different toggles or the different flags you can use to get a different output. So like one of them would be / all, which would show all your internet network configurations, not configurations, I'm sorry, all your network interfaces. And that if you're not quite sure of the command you need to be using or the toggle you need to be using, that / question mark is a very useful tool.
Dakota, thanks so much for giving us kind of a walk around the command line. Really appreciate it, man.
Absolutely, anytime.